FilthyRobot here, just about to start the breakdown of the Baldur Gate 3 classes, and wanted to remind you all that we do not have complete information for this quite yet. A number of these classes are in the game, but only up to level 5 as part of early access, and a number of these classes are not, or subclasses rather, are not yet in the game at all. So the information I'm going to provide to you guys is a little bit of data mine stuff collected on websites, a little bit of my own D&D knowledge going into this, a little bit of previous subclasses, and a little bit of the information released on the games. What this means is some of these things are going to be a little bit inaccurate. Some things that are reported as an action might be a bonus reaction. Some of the things that happen in normal mechanics of D&D may not apply to the Baldur's Gate 3 game. They may have tweaked these engines a little bit. Where I notice these differences or where I can see them, I'm going to try to highlight them. And when I think these are going to have implications on how the character plays, I'm going to mention that. But just a caveat that not all of this information will be exactly accurate because of the sources that we're drawing from. All right, let's talk Baldur's Gate 3 fighters. So what have they given us to work with? So in general, fighter class is a really versatile class. 1 point in fighter gets you strength and con saving throws if you start that. Con saving throws are really good for casters. They're okay for other classes, non-caster classes, but they're just really good for casters. It's what their ability to maintain concentration is based on. Fighters get you light, medium, and heavy armor proficiencies and shield proficiencies, which are all the armor classes in the game. Fighters get you martial weapons and simple weapons, which are all the weapons in the game, basically. And then they are D10 HP dice, which is the second best HP progression of all the classes as well. They make an amazing single point multi-class, especially if you take them first and you want to go caster afterwards, because it gives you access to all the things that casters are missing one way or the other, be it armor, be it shields, be it weapon proficiencies, doesn't matter. Be it con saves, all of these things come with 1 point in fighter. In addition to all of that, which is pretty good, they also have really interesting class progression. This is before subclasses. They subclass at 3, which is as late as it gets for subclasses. So splashing a fighter subclass is hard, although splashing fighter for 1 is quite good. Action Surge and Second Wind Second Wind's a healing ability. Action Surge is basically what it sounds like. It's an extra action. These are both single use things that replenish on rests. They're okay. Fighter progression for attacks is melee progression. So they get their second attack at 5, but they get a unique fighter, which is third attack at 11. And then they get... The most interesting thing about them is their feat progression, which is at 4. They get extra feats at 4 and 8, like everybody else, 4, 8, 12, 16. But they also get extra additional feats at 6 and 10, which is, I say 6 and 10 and meant not 6 and 10. It must be later on. It must be 6 and then past the progression of this game. So they get 1 extra feat at 6, I guess, here. That's all pretty good for starting. It means if you wish to go pure fighter, you can do anything with them. So you can be a ranged fighter, like with a bow. You can be a tank fighter. You can be a damage fighter. You can multi-spec with fighter. If you do build any of the melee style fighters, or even not melee, you can take extra feats to specialize in some obscure thing. Maybe it's grappling. Maybe it's knocking people down. Maybe it's just some bizarre form of tanking that you're doing that you can specialize into. All these things are super cool as the fighter chassis that lets you do that, lets you get into that way. Multi-specking in fighter is a little bit easier too. Most classes have a single or sometimes a double stat requirement. You have to have 13 of the class your of the requirement of the stat that the class requires when multi-specking in or out. So if you want to multi-spec a cleric, you need 13 wisdom to either leave cleric and become a different class, or to be a different class and enter cleric as a multi-class. Fighter gives you the option of dex or strength for that, which is a little bit more flexible. So if you are multi-specking fighter, it is a jack of all trades class. It can do anything and you could specialize as much into that as you want. It's a very interesting class to me. I quite like it. Let's take a look at the inherent subclasses they've given us. They've given us the, what's the first one here? This is the Battle Master, one of my favorite one of my favorite base D&D subclasses, which is you gain superiority dice which give you maneuvers. Which maneuvers you get is dependent on the game that implements it. So we're kind of at the mercy of what Baldur's Gate 3 gives us for this. I'm not sure which ones they have, but these things often do a variety of small but interesting things. They might make you be able to add a dice to an attack that missed to hit. They might be able to move allies or swap positions. They might be able to move enemies around the battlefield a little bit. They might make enemies have to make save throws or be proned or knocked down or pushed or this type of thing. In general, it's a pretty fun set of features for a subclass, and it synergizes really nicely with fighters specializing via extra feats into doing something fairly unique. They might get benefits on doing that as the Battlemaster subclass, which might add options to do that. For example, if you maybe specialize in a character that's good at proning people, having an additional source of doing that through Battlemaster stuff kind of allows you to do that specialization better, or perhaps it allows you to take advantage of it in a way you might not be able to otherwise. Now that you have done a thing, you can take advantage of it via the subclass stuff. I really like Battlemaster. It's gonna How strong it is depends on what they give us for these tools, but by and large, the class is a really fun subclass to play with. Moving on, we've got Eldritch Knight. I don't tend to like Eldritch Knights. This again is everyone's first thought is, well, could I have a wizard who could also be a fighter? And the answer is resoundingly no. But the Eldritch Knight attempts that. The way this type of Gish class tends to work is you tend to have reduced spell progression. So in this case, the Eldritch Knight uses the wizard spell list, a subset of the wizard spell list, if I recall correctly, and the spell progression is slower. So whereas wizards are getting it at 1, 3, 5, 7, they get the next tier of spell. The class progression is half that, I believe, for the Eldritch Knight subclass. However, you don't give up any of the fighter progression to do this. So you get all of the powers of the fighter core class while still getting access to some spells. You're going to get, a lot of times you end up with tanking spells like, maybe spells that are relevant pretty much at any stage you get them, like Shield or Blur or maybe Haste later, right? These types of spells, they just come online much later because you're getting them much later. But that's the type of thing you tend to do with classes like this. They're okay. It's really going to depend on what subclass features they give us. The Eldritch Knight in particular has some really nice subclass features in the base game. As with all spellcasters who also want to be melee, you're going to run into issues with being able to use spells that require touch gestures. So you can't hold a weapon and a shield and cast certain spells in the base game to start with. Maybe Baldur's Gate 3 relaxes this, maybe it doesn't. Maybe they make some subclass feature in the Eldritch Knight that allows you to do that, or maybe they don't. Those types of considerations are going to be defining for how good this is. That said, Eldritch Knight does get core fighter stuff and gets con saves, etc. It's an okay chassis for a tank. Although I haven't found the Eldritch Knight to be that exciting by and large. Oh, another thing that might impact that too is what cantrips do we have access to. There's some pretty powerful later cantrips that combine nicely with weapon attacks to allow you to basically take weapon attacks while providing some beneficial above and beyond weapon thing, which you can do through cantrips. But those are not in the core D&D game. They are a expansion essentially. So if those are in the game, that's a nice thing for these classes that want to be in melee range and use some sort of spell feature. So we'll have to see. It's to be determined how good this class is going to be based on what features they give us as part of the base game. All right. And then there's the champion subclass. This is a subclass for your uninterested friend who doesn't ever want to become interested in D&D. This is the perfect class for them. The champion subclass allows you to crit on 19s or 20s. Yeah, it's pretty unexciting. There's stuff you could do with it. There are, depending on what feats they give us, I'm not sure what those will be, exactly the full range of feats. There are other things that can combine with crits to make them more interesting. Sometimes there's magical weapons that combine with crits as well that do interesting things. Crits are a very powerful thing, so having double the number of crits is okay, and the fighter does attack a lot, but it is not a very defining characteristic of a character just to crit on a 19 or a 20 as opposed to just a 20. It doesn't apply to ability checks, so it doesn't work for like skill monkey kind of stuff, but it's just weapon attacks, and it's a fairly unexciting thing. I'll be curious what else they've added. In the core game, it's things like, it's basic fighter stuff, but more of it, like more weapon specializations, this type of thing. I don't know if that is going to be the case with the Baldur's Gate champion. I'm actually surprised to see it in here. They've gone with a pretty interesting, mostly a pretty interesting list of subclasses, and I would consider this probably the least interesting fighter subclass available in the game across all expansions. So maybe they've leaned into the critical stuff in a way that I'm not predicting yet via either feats or weapons in such a way that makes it a bit more interesting, but initially not that exciting. So what do I think about the fighter as a whole? I think whether or not I play fighters in this game in the first playthrough or two is going to be dependent entirely on what interesting feats they have, and to maybe a lesser degree, how much gear they throw at us. Gear progression in D&D tends not to be very interesting, mostly because you're just doing the standard start with base gear, get the best base gear that is available to your class. So for example, if heavy armor, maybe you get like a full suit of plate as opposed to like the crappy like chainmail to begin with or something, right? One of these deals. And then you progress into like +1s, +2s, +3s basically as you get there, which is just additional AC, or for the weapons, the additional accuracy and damage. Now, if they're creative with their weapons and it's like a high magic world where you find a lot of gear, and the gear is interesting, does interesting things, like maybe it applies effects or it makes you behave differently than you might behave normally, then that starts to get a bit more interesting. The fighter gets access to all the gear that you could possibly want. I don't know if they're going to enforce any of the attunement stuff, like how much of the gear requires attunement and how many attunement slots you're given compared to the base game. So, and I don't know if it's going to be a high magic or a low magic kind of experience. So we're going to see a lot of unique, interesting gear and a lot of gear per character. So it's going to be really transformative, while classes with access to a ton of gear is going to be are going to be a bit more interesting there. Maybe the fighter excels there again. So this one to me is really to be determined based on a lot of other characteristics of the system we're going to be playing in. And that really makes sense with the fighter, right? The fighter is super flexible, and how powerful that flexibility is entirely determines on what you can flex into. So here's fingers crossed that they give us lots of interesting stuff to flex into, and our fighters get to be super cool, because I do love the fighter build. Anyways, let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you soon.